Hi everybody, it's Henry from Oddity Watch, and I'm here again with another paranormal anomaly that we're going to explore. In my last article, I took you all down to southern Indiana, where we talked about an eerie mimic that is seemingly a woman cut in half. I did tease that I may be covering the Yosemite crawling hawk for my next article. However, I feel that this story that I'm about to cover will be a nice buffer before we tackle the macabre story of the Yosemite crawling hawk. So, you may be asking yourself, Henry, where the hell are you taking me this time? And the answer is, Mason County in Washington State. That's right. We're getting into some rainy weather, so put on your galoshes and strap in as we get deep into the Rodderson experiments. We're leaving the cryptozoology field today and stepping into the ufology world. Now, some key things to note before we cover our first story is that there are no UFOs in the Rodderson experiments, but rather USOs, unidentified submerged objects. They also seem to be totally disconnected and unrelated aside from a USO sighting taking place the same day an experiment was conducted. And now there's truly no best place to start than the beginning. In 1979, there was a sleepy town called Penny Spring, named so because prospectors thought the land showed promise of copper. This town was roughly 15 miles away from Hood Canal with a population of a whopping 417 people. They didn't have much industry in this town, and everybody was on edge with talks of a paper mill possibly being built in the near future. The fear was with an expanding city that offered more jobs, more people would come to the town and soon they would be surrounded by strangers. Since this was 1979, the satanic panic was slowly on the rise into the people of Penny Spring. A stranger was almost certainly a devil worshipper. Most of the townfolk made a living off game and fish and were perfectly happy with the way things were. One of these people was Jerry Rodderson. Jerry Rodderson wasn't a Penny Spring native, but he had lived there with his wife, Chloe, for nearly 17 years. He would go off hunting with his brother-in-law, Fern Bellevue. Fern was one of the local butchers as well, so any game that they got, Fern would butcher it, and then sell the meat and they would split the profit down the middle. Needless to say, Fern knew Jerry extremely well, which is an important thing to remember later on. On a cold November morning, Jerry and Fern went out hunting, but since it was so damn cold, they decided they would stay in the warm truck and just shoot deer from the windows. Fern described sitting in the truck as quiet, but a normal, comfortable kind of quiet. Fern said that he was scanning the tree line for any movement when he felt Jerry looking at him. The comforting silence became unnatural and eerie. Fern says he turned around to face Jerry and instantly knew that something was wrong with him. According to Fern, Jerry's right eye became lazy and drifted upward, while his left eye seemed to look just past Fern. Here is the conversation that followed. "Hey man, you okay?" "Hello man, I'm okay." "You sure you just don't want me to take you to the hospital? You don't look so good." "I am okay. How are you? Do you feel stressed or scared?" "No, I can't say I do. I'm a little worried about you though, but I ain't scared." "Good. If I attempted to bite your face, would you be frightened?" Yeah, I would, Jerry." Jerry took off his left leather glove and proceeded to bite all of his own fingers off. Fern described Jerry as calm while biting, bracing his own wrist to steady it while he snapped his finger bones in half. The sound of a wet crunch and the smell of sweet copper had caused many sleepless nights for Fern. Once all the fingers were bitten off and the truck cab was littered with blood splatters, Jerry smiled. He opened his mouth and 4 fingers rolled off of his tongue and fell on the floorboard with a moist thud. Jerry continued to smile. Fern reeled back in a state of shock. He had no idea what to say. "How do you feel now? Are you frightened?" Fern nodded his head. How do you feel now? Are you frightened? Fern didn't respond. Please, answer the question either with yes or no. How do you feel now? Are you frightened? Yes. Why? I have not injured you in any way. Only myself. I am also calm and displaying a non-threatening facial expression. I guess I just wasn't expecting that. I don't know what to do. Blood just makes me queasy. A violent deviation from normal circumstances that makes you feel as if you have no control in a situation, and the sight of blood is innately unpleasant to you. Is this a proper analysis? Yes. Thank you. Jerry's eyes return to normal and he begins screaming in agony. Fern races to the hospital and luckily makes it in time before Jerry dies of blood loss. Fern gave the doctor the 4 fingers on the floorboard of his truck. When asked where the thumb was, Fern said that he didn't know. The doctors were not able to successfully reattach the fingers. Later that night, one of the nurses walked past Jerry's hospital bed, only to find him leaning over the side with a puddle of red-orange vomit splattered on the ground. In the puddle of vomit was Jerry's missing thumb. Over the course of a few years, rumors spread that Jerry Rodderson was a devil worshipper and he was possessed at the time. You may think that this would have been just a stain on his character, but it ultimately sent him to prison for a few years. An eyewitness incorrectly identified Jerry of raping a 59-year-old woman, even though Jerry was out of state at that time. Jerry was given a retrial after new, indisputable evidence surfaced which linked the woman's nephew as the rapist. 5 years after his release from prison, Jerry killed, this will be elaborated upon later in the article, himself in the midst of the satanic panic. His suicide letter was one sentence: "The whistling won't stop." I spoke to Fern about the whole incident, and he said that there were 2 details that a lot of people seem to leave out whenever they retell the story. The first detail is that, while driving down by the canal on the way to the hospital, he saw something. A big something. Fern describes what he saw as a dark, egg-like thing speeding just below the surface of the water, matching the speed of his truck when he slowed down and he sped up. Fern said that he must have been going 120 trying to get away from this thing because something didn't feel right. Fern told me that adrenaline and fear had filled his body, which left him shaken and nauseous. The egg eventually dove deep down into the canal and disappeared, but Fern said just before it did, he heard some sort of strange melody, a sort of chime with 5 distinct notes. When he said that, Fern got up from his recliner and shuffled to his piano. His fingers naturally shook from old age, but they trembled a little more when he brought his fingers up to the middle C part of the piano. I'm not much of a music guy and it would be embarrassing for me to act like I knew what I was talking about. However, Fern played a lower sounding note, followed by 3 higher sounding notes and then returned to the original lower note. I asked Fern if he kept in touch with Jerry or talked about what had happened after he got out of the hospital, and to which Fern put a finger up to me and said, "I'm getting to that. Just hold on." I shut up and I let Fern finish his story. After Jerry got out of the hospital, Fern and his little sister Chloe were very supportive, and they helped Jerry try to return to some sense of normalcy. One late night after a family barbecue, Fern and Jerry sat on the back sipping on a beer, looking at the stars when Fern asked him if he remembered doing what he did. Jerry said that he did, and he could feel the whole thing, but he just couldn't control his body. Fern asked him what he thinks may have caused it, and to which Jerry said, "I don't know, but the entire time that I was under, all I could hear was a whistling. It drowned out all of my thoughts and it's all I could focus on. The whistling got so loud, louder than anything I'd ever heard, and that's saying something considering I worked on a flight line in the army. And then Jerry whistled what he heard in his head, and Fern instantly recognized it as the tune that he had heard from the egg. Many experiments happened where people who were abducted mentioned the same whistling in their heads. When asked to whistle the tune, it's almost exactly the same melody that Fern had heard from the egg. Sadly though, Fern's story is the only one that mentions the egg making the odd tune. And that is the only true connection we have between the experiments and the egg, except for the same-day sightings. Now, it's hard to pin down exactly what the experiments are trying to prove or disprove, but it does seem like whatever's behind this is collecting data on human behavior, emotions, and reactions. If Penny Spring were still the town, you could have talked to anyone and they would have said the same sort of story about people acting strange. Some of the older people blamed the abnormal behavior on the rise of Satanism in the country. So much so that a man named Al Harris ran for sheriff, promising that he, with the help of the mayor, would exorcise Penny Spring. Harris won in a landslide. The fear only doubled when the paper mill actually did come to town and brought at least 100 other people with it. This paper mill was integrated, essentially meaning that it had a pulp mill on site as well. I don't know if you've ever been through a town with a paper mill, but it does not have a very pleasant smell. To me, it kind of has a rancid sewage aroma. The town was now a hub for strange activity, horrible odors, and distrust. People kept to themselves and only really spoke to each other when necessary, which is why the next few strange cases stuck out in people's minds. I spoke to a bartender who lived in a town called Cedar Point, which used to be 24 miles north of Penny Spring. She had managed a bar in Penny Spring called Critters, which was the stage for one of these experiments. The bartender, April, says that every night a man would come in soaking wet, regardless if it had been raining or not. The strange man was dressed plainly, she said, but he would walk down to the end of the bar in the exact same path and then immediately turn around and walk out. April said that if someone was in his way, he would stop, wait for the person to move, and then finish the walk. She went on to say that the man made no attempt to talk to anyone, and he would ignore anybody who would try to talk to him. However, the one night that he didn't come in, a woman walked in instead. April said that she had a huge, tireless smile on her face with eyes that seemed misaligned and vacant. The woman walked in the same path as the man did, but on her way back she stopped and stared at a regular, Cody Jebson, who was sitting at the bar. She didn't look like she was staring at anything in particular, but her eyes were sort of in the direction of Cody. She started to talk to him in this weird, soothing voice. I don't know, I just didn't like it. The following is the interaction between the woman and Cody, from what April could remember. Can I help you? You look like you have kids. Well, I do. Am I pleasant to you? I suppose. Do you ever become sexually aroused from the thought of eating one of your children? Excuse me? Do you ever have sexual fantasies in which you boil one of your children alive and eat their meat right off their bones? You better leave me alone right now. I'm not afraid to hit a woman. I have incited rage in you despite my pleasant demeanor and voice. Why? This is your last chance to go. At this time, the woman's face distorts into a cartoonish, snarling grimace. She reaches into her pocket and pulls out a snub-nosed revolver, pointing it at Cody. His eyes widen and his face drains of all color. You have very handsome eyes. You are handsome. You are kind. I admire you. What? Please don't shoot. I have money, please. Before, you didn't care about my pleasant voice and demeanor. Instead, you focused on what I was saying. Now you do not care what I'm saying and you're focused on my demeanor. Why is this? Cody, at a loss for words, just shrugs. Before, you did not care about my pleasant voice and demeanor. Instead, you focused on what I was saying. Now you do not care what I'm saying and you are focused on my demeanor. Why is this? I don't know. I really don't. Just, please put the gun away. The woman stood quietly staring at Cody, and then she pressed the gun under her chin and pulled the trigger. No bang followed, only a click. The woman fell backwards onto the ground. April called the authorities and told them what had happened, and then rushed the woman to the hospital. The woman was later identified as Frida Hernandez, who had been missing from her home in California for approximately 3 months when she had walked into the bar. The gun that she was carrying was unloaded at the time, but she dry-fired it under her chin, and she became comatose. She died while in her coma a little over a decade later. Toxicology reports said that Frida had no narcotics or alcohol in her system, but she was heavily dehydrated. Her clothes were covered in a white, flaky substance which was later revealed to be salt. Law enforcement said that this was probably from the canal, which they did a sweep of to see if they could find her abandoned car, or anything that might explain her abhorrent behavior and why she went missing. They didn't find anything like that, but April said that one of the officers, who happened to be a regular at Critters, said he saw a strange object floating above the canal, which dove into the cold water a few seconds later. The other officer heard a splash and saw what looked like a whale breaking the surface of the water, and then diving back down. After that, the Hernandez case was taken over by the FBI. While in her coma, Frida amassed a group of protesters demanding the doctors to remove her feeding tube. They said that the hospital was keeping an agent of the devil alive when the Lord already passed his divine judgment. The nurses said that every once in a while, Frida would weakly hum some sort of strange tune. This kept giving the medical staff false hope that she was exiting her comatose state. Nurses also claimed to have seen Frida walking past doorways in the middle of the night, but when they looked out into the middle of the hallway, no one was there. They would go to her room and she was still there. It's impossible to say that if the humming the nurses heard was the same tune as what Fern and Jerry had heard, but I would put my money down saying that it was. I asked around Cedar Point to see if anybody had worked or knew anybody who had worked at the paper mill in Penny Spring. I didn't have any luck, but they told me to drive about 16 miles southeast to a town named Finch. There, I had better luck on the paper mill story, but in a completely different way. I talked to 6 different people separately who told me the same story with a few different details. They all claimed that they went to apply for a job at the paper mill, but there were no cars outside. When they knocked on the door of the office buildings adjacent to the paper mill, they saw that there was no furniture inside. Furthermore, they claimed the building looked brand new despite being a few years old. They looked into the actual mill and essentially saw the same thing. Brand new equipment that had not been used. Needless to say, it was a little bit odd that the town of Penny Spring smelled like it had a paper mill, yet it looked like it had never been used. I spoke to one man, Gary Hunter, who told me the story. I never wanted to work at the mill, but I was fresh out of college and my late wife and I had a baby on the way, so I figured it would be the best place to go since they'd be hiring. I went to the mill, which is close to the canal, and was hoping I could get a job temporarily until I found something better. I have heard that the mill was empty, but I didn't really believe that. I mean, who would build an entire mill and leave it empty? It just didn't make sense to me. When I pulled up and I saw a lot of cars in the lot, I thought it was promising. I got out of my car and was heading towards the offices when I heard somebody call out from behind me. I turned around and I saw this cockeyed fellow who was just drenched head to toe. I asked him if he was alright and he said yes. I just came from the canal. Are you here for a job? I told him yes and he said go into the mill and wait for the others. I shrugged and I went in where I saw around 10 or 15 people just standing around. We must have waited for a good 30 minutes before that fella came back into the mill. He said, "The owners of this mill have let me lease it for today to do a study. If you're interested, you can all walk out if you're worth $500 each." Well, it wasn't what I had hoped for, but I thought, why the hell not? We agree and he tells us to go back to the back of the mill. We head back and there's a small hallway with 2 doors. He tells us to go into the first one. Once we're inside, we hear the door lock. Now I'm starting to get nervous because I heard there were, Satanists in this area, and I thought I got mixed up in something bad. Which I did. We were in a weird room with a huge window, looking out into a room with a metal chair and a table. Kind of like an interrogation room. Except there is a record player in the middle. We see the cockeyed fella enter the other room with a tote bag, and he just starts taking off all of his clothes. He took everything off but his shoes and socks. A couple of us are snickering and the women are blushing. And then he just puts a record on and this weird music starts playing. It was very repetitive. I must have only had 4 or 5 notes that just kept repeating. He had the volume up uncomfortably loud. The man opened his bag and pulled out a carrot, which he ate extremely slow. We all looked at each other, wondering if anybody else was seeing this. I started wondering what kind of study this was. Once he's done with the carrot, he reached into his bag and he pulled out another carrot. This time he would chew and then spit the carrot out. Chew then spit, chew then spit. He did this until it was almost completely gone, and his chest was covered in orange, chunky slime. I thought it was weird, but it was alright since it was supposed to be a study, He reached back into his bag again and he pulled out a pack of gum, scissors, and a mason jar. He set the mason jar and scissors off to the side. He unwrapped each piece of gum, separated the gum and the wrappers and organized them all. He then put each piece of gum in his mouth individually and he chewed it. He took the massive wad of gum out of his mouth and placed it on the table, smoothing it out like it was clay. Once it was flat like a plate, he put the wrappers in his mouth and then he swallowed them whole. He grabbed the scissors and he started to cut out locks of his own hair. He placed each lock on the gum plate and I thought to myself, oh no, he ain't gonna. And then he did. He folded the gum covered in a pile of his hair up like a taco and he started to eat it. It was painful to watch and I could feel myself cringe. Everybody else was getting uncomfortable too. Once he choked down the whole thing, he stood up, and I'd almost forgotten he was also nude from the waist down. He asked us how we felt so far. Some of us said we felt fine, but some of the others were just too weirded out. He said that they could leave if they wanted, but he would only pay them $100 each. They took the money and they left. The guy sat back down in his chair and brought out a second mason jar that was filled with this thick red liquid. It had pink chunks floating in it too. He grabbed the first, empty mason jar and proceeded to, he threw up in it. He filled it up about a quarter of the way. It was orange with blue chunks of gum and hair floating in it. Well, he had took a sip from the red mason jar, and then he took a sip from the one that he had thrown up in. I almost hurled myself. He asked us again how we felt, and again, a few decided to leave, which he paid about $250. I saw only about 4 people, including myself, were left, but the others seemed absent. Their faces didn't have any emotion, and they were humming that song playing on the record. He got back in his chair and he said that he was on the last part. He grabbed those scissors again and stood up and grabbed his pecker, which I couldn't take anymore. I left and I didn't even bother asking for money. I don't know what he did, but I kind of got the idea of what he was going to do. I asked Gary if he had reported this incident to the police, which apparently he did. The police said that they had walked into a bloodbath. There were blood splatters all over the floor and walls. On the table were the 2 mason jars, which the police tested and had found the red mason jars filled with deer blood and offal. They found a dead man next to the canal. He was nude aside from his socks and shoes. He had patches of hair missing and he was castrated. The FBI took the case, thinking that it may be tied to the Hernandez case. Through their investigation, the FBI learned that the man was Eddie Sumter, who had gone missing from Seattle 2 weeks earlier. The 3 people who had stayed in the mill when Gary left were reported missing and their clothes were found next to Sumter's body. Now, you may be thinking that Sumter died from blood loss, right? Well, sadly, you're wrong. The official coroner's report stated that while he was losing a lot of blood, they actually found that his lungs were filled with salt water. And you know what else they found? His penis in his stomach. I asked Gary if he knew what had happened to the record, which may have seemed like an odd question after everything he had just told me. He said he didn't know, but the melody still pops in his head every once in a while. He said when it does pop in his head, it becomes so loud that he can't even think, and there had even been times when he had torn pieces of aluminum foil up and he ate it. He said that this had caused some GI issues, but he simply can't help it. When the melody is in his head, he described it like climbing in the back seat of his own body. He was apprehensive about whistling the melody for me, but when he did it, it was a perfect match to what Fern had played on the piano. Back in the 80s and early 90s, people are almost certain that this was Satanism. But now people have begun shifting their theories and credit the behavior to otherworldly beings such as aliens or possibly even time travel. If we knew what the egg was or had any other information on it, then we could go in a certain direction with these other stories. Unfortunately, the egg has very little sightings and each sighting greatly differs between each other. Hell, Fern is the only one who said it was an egg. No one else refers to it as such. One thing that is consistent, however, is that it's a large and it's a very dark object. Some interesting stories do float around the Hood Canal area though describing this object. One fisherman said it was a disc covered in black eyes that claimed to be the new god of this realm. Another person claimed that it wasn't an object at all, but rather an absolute emptiness in space. One woman said she saw a spear rise out of the water and unfurl itself into a giant, beautiful mermaid with a black tail. She said the mermaid coaxed her to come into the water so she could suckle on its breasts. It seems that the farther away we get from the satanic panic, the more people perceive the whole chain of events differently. But a very consistent element in all of this is the melody. We know that the melody is the cause for most of these people to do what they do, and that being exposed to it for long periods of time make you more susceptible. Also, it seems that the melody is a permanent part of the person, like a stain on their mind. There are probably a number of questions that you want to ask, but here are 2 that I can answer indefinitely. If the melody is a stain on the mind, how did it affect Jerry Rodderson initially and never affect him again? Why are these called the Rodderson experiments and not the Hood Canal experiments? Well, luckily for you, I can answer these questions at relatively the same time. Do you remember how I said that Jerry Rodderson committed suicide and his suicide letter was him saying that he wants the whistling to stop? Well, some Rodderson experiment truth hunters subscribe to a theory that Jerry Rodderson never actually killed himself. Yes, a note was found saying, "The whistling won't stop," but it clearly doesn't state that he committed suicide. And additionally, a body was never found. In the eyes of the town, Jerry was a devil worshipper who had vanished, so good riddance. Sheriff Harris is actually the one who decided not to look for Jerry after his disappearance. He didn't even ask Chloe or Fern about his disappearance. Instead, he told them that he had just committed suicide. The theory goes that Jerry fought the call of the egg every day, but eventually he couldn't fight it anymore. In his last hazy moments of coherency, Jerry wrote down, "The whistling won't stop," and he surrendered himself. But the theory wouldn't exist without eyewitness accounts disputing the death of Jerry Rodderson. The year is 1998 and the town of Penny Spring died along with the satanic panic. Most of the residents had either moved to Cedar Point or Finch and were living a suburban lifestyle. One resident in particular was Gloria Gay. She moved to a cul-de-sac named Blue Jay Way in Finch. It was a mildly warm day in June and Gloria had just finished baking an apple pie that she was going to take to a potluck 3 doors down, when she heard a knock on her door. Gloria wiped her hands off on her apron and shuffled to the door, assuming it was Beth from 3 doors down, wondering if she was done baking yet. When Gloria answered the door, she saw a taller man with a head of gray, wispy hair, under a Bowers hat with his back facing Gloria. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man, not turning around to face Gloria, admired her home, specifically how all of the walls met at 90-degree angles. Unsure of what to say, Gloria simply said, "Thank you." The man then walked away down the cul-de-sac. As he walked away, Gloria noticed that he had no fingers on his left hand. At the potluck, she described the strange encounter, to which a man said the only person he had ever known to be missing all of his left fingers was Jerry Rodderson. A few nights later, Gloria would wake up to the sound of her beagle barking. When Gloria got out of bed, she saw the man with his back turned to her standing in her lawn. Gloria went to call the police, but by the time she untangled the phone cord and walked back to the window, the man was gone. Over the course of the next few weeks, people wondered where Gloria had gone, and she hadn't been outside or to church in a while. It wouldn't be until the police had found her malnourished, dehydrated, and on the brink of death that anybody would have guessed that she was in any danger. When Gloria was recovering in the hospital, she told the police that a man with no fingers on his left hand had kidnapped her, and he had stuffed her in a crate. He asked her continuously, "Why do you hate this? You live in a home filled with 90-degree angles. Why does this bother you?" She described the man as genuinely curious, which frightened her to say that she didn't think he was intentionally being malicious. The most haunting thing to her, though, was how he could whistle the same tune over and over again. Gloria recovered just fine with the help of her friends, family, and congregation. The police initially thought that this might have been a hate crime because Gloria was the only black woman on Blue Jay Way. They ruled this theory out since the nature of the crime seemed to lean towards mental illness. The police checked to see if there were any missing persons with mental illness in the county, or anybody who would fit the description, but this came to a dead end. The police then checked to see if there was anybody with a criminal record that fit the man's description, but this also yielded no answers. Eventually, the police just put out an advisory and told people if they saw this man to call the police immediately. This was the last case that had generated a police record, but it didn't take long for the myth of Jerry Rodderson to spread over Mason County. People talked about the fingerless man who was possessed by aliens and experimented on his community to relearn what humanity was. Many people have a story about being approached by Jerry Rodderson, his back completely turned to them and asking uncomfortable, strange questions. These word-of-mouth stories began to grow in popularity, and all of the previous experiments were completely accredited to Rodderson, and thus these strange events being named the Rodderson experiments.